Hello everyone, welcome to the final part of my GC bias video series. Today we are going to talk about a niche topic, that is single position GC correction. So let's dive in. So in the previous video, we talked about the lowest bin based GC correction. So let's just review the limitations of such GC correction method. First of all, if you have a larger genomic bin size to estimate the GC bias in this method, then you are going to have lower resolution in the estimated GC content per bin. Lower resolution in estimated GC content means worse GC correction. Now, the thing is, you may say that let's divide the whole genome into very small bins, then that will actually solve this problem, right? But can we make the bins very small? No, we cannot. Because if the sequencing depth is not that high, then the coverage of very small bins will look extremely noisy. And in such a scenario, you are going to get very poor GC correction factor estimation. In fact, for samples with very low pass whole genome sequencing such as 0.1x, your bin size can only be greater than or equal to 1 megabase, which is actually extremely large. And in those cases, the GC bias curve will not have that nice bell shape. Rather, it will be linearly increasing, which doesn't really make sense. So, the solution is to use a single position GC correction method, which is more accurate. Now, there is this paper which introduced the concept of single position GC correction in 2012. But reading this paper is not everyone's cup of tea. It's a bit difficult to understand, but don't worry, I'm going to explain everything about this method with example so that everything is crystal clear to you after going through the tutorial. The first step is to calculate the expected read frequency per GC level. So what does that mean? Let us see visually. So suppose this is our reference genome. What we are going to do is we are going to take a GC context window. So this is a window and you can choose a certain size for this window. Suppose for our case, we choose the size 300 base pair. You can even choose 200 base pair or 500 base pair. I will talk about the choice a little bit later on. But let's just assume for now that the window size is 300 base pair. So we are going to put this window at the start of the reference genome and we are going to count the number of GC in this 300 size window in the reference genome. So basically in this area, we are going to count the number of GC and store it somewhere. Then we are going to move this window one base pair to the right. And again, we are going to count the number of GC in this position of the reference genome. We are going to keep doing this for each position of the reference genome by putting the sliding window on that position of the reference genome. So what exactly are we trying to achieve here? So the thing is, we are measuring the GC count for each position of the reference genome. So if the context window size is of size n, suppose this is of size n or in our case 300, then the possible GC counts in each window position can be 0, 1, 2 up to n. So for a window size of 300, there can be from 0 to 300 possible GC count, right? So GC count can be 0, GC count can be 1, GC count can be 100, and GC count can be highest 300 for a 300 size window. So what we are trying to do here is we are trying to count the number of reference genome positions. This is very, very important. We are trying to count the number of reference genome positions with GC count 0, GC count 1, GC count 2, up until GC count n minus 1 and GC count n. Okay, so suppose we are going to have 10 positions where we have found GC count to be 0. Maybe we are going to have 200 positions where the GC count is actually 100 and so on and so forth. Now, the question is, what should be the GC context window size and why are we actually doing this counting? This is sort of our expected count. So we are expecting these number of positions to have GC count 0, GC count 1, etc. Now, how about choosing the GC context window size? Now, when you do sequencing in a sequencing machine, it has a target read length, such as 75, 150, or 200. That means most of the reads will be around this range. So if the target length is 150, most of the reads sequenced will be around size 150. So your GC context window size should be a little bit larger than 150 in that case. So the size should be larger than the target length to cover the GC scenario of each whole read that is sequenced. That is the key. So we have done the counting, and by counting, we can actually fill in a very nice table. And this is what the table looks like. So we have the different GC counts from 0 to n. and we have the window position number. So 25 window positions with DC count 0, 330 window positions with DC count 99, and so on and so forth. And we can take the mean of these window position counts, and maybe that mean is 200. So we are not going to work with these raw counts. Rather, we are going to calculate the relative frequency by dividing by the mean 200. And we are going to get these numbers. So again, I've asked you before and I'm asking this again. We are doing all of these things. I think it's pretty clear what we are doing, but what are we trying to achieve? And how are we relating all these things to expected read frequency? Like how do these things relate to expected read frequency? So the thing is, these are the GC count window frequencies relative to mean. We expect to see if there was no GC bias during our sequencing pipeline. Understand that so far we haven't considered any sample. We are simply taking the reference genome and we are sliding a window across that genome. We are not doing anything else here. There is no sample involved, no sequencing involved. So these are the basically relative frequency we expect to see, and we can call these frequencies as expected frequencies. When we are going to inspect the GC context windows around reads from an actual sequence sample, not from the reference genome, but from an actual sequence sample, we are going to see that these numbers will change drastically, and that is because of the GC bias. So from now on, we are going to call this last column as expected frequency. So now it is time to calculate the observed sample read frequency per GC level. Again, we have the reference genome. We have a sample which we sequenced using some sequencing technique. And after sequencing those reads, we have to align those reads to the reference genome. I mean, every bioinformatician who is familiar with a little bit of biology will know about this, that we have to align the reads to the reference genome. So these are the aligned sample reads. Now, some of them can be a little bit heterogeneous in size. That is why I haven't kept the sizes all similar. They can be a little bit different. So what we are going to do is we are going to take the same GC context window of size 300, or in general we can call it size n. We are going to put it at the starting position of the first read. And so you can see that this is the GC context of this first read, and you can get the GC count from the reference genome in this position. Similarly, we are going to put the sliding window at the starting position of this read, sample read again, and this is the GC context, and we are going to get the GC count of this position. Same thing here, going to get the GC count here, going to get the GC count here, 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 and we are going to continue to do this for all the sample reads. Remember that we are not sliding the window across the whole genome anymore. Rather, we are only putting the windows guided by this sample reads sequenced. So basically, the summary is this. So the reads of a sequence sample are aligned to the reference genome, and we put our n size context window at the start position of each aligned read and retrieve the GC count, right? This is the thing we have discussed so far, and we are summarizing it here. Now, what we need to do is we need to do the same count. We need to count the number of read positions with GC count 0, 1, 2, and n-1 and n, same as before. And if we do that, we can easily populate this table. This looks exactly the same as the table that we actually calculated previously when we got our expected sample rate frequency. And we know what to do now. We have the mean 200. So we have to divide everything by 200 to get the relative frequency. So you can see the relative frequency right here. Now understand that these are the GC count window frequencies we actually see because of GC bias in our sequencing pipeline. And that is why we call this last column observed frequencies. And so we are going to name it in this way. Now, finally, we can calculate the GC bias. We have the GC count. We have the expected frequency we calculated previously. We also have the observed frequency we got previously. Now we can get the GC bias by dividing the observed frequencies by the expected frequencies. So we can get these values. So very important to understand is if any of these values are greater than 1, for example here, then those GC count areas have actually more reads than we expect. That means we need to artificially decrease their count. If we have GC bias less than 1, for example, in these areas, that means we have less reads in these GC count regions than expect, and we need to increase their count. It is very similar to the lowest concept, except for we are not using any bin right here. So how do we get the GC correction factor? For places with lower than expected GC bias value, we are going to have to increase the count. For places which have like bigger than expected GC bias value, we are going to have to decrease their count artificially. So GC correction factor for each GC count is the inverse of its bias value. So if this bias value is 3, then GC correction factor for this region will be 1 by 3. So let me explain it with an example. Suppose we have a sample read that has a GC count of 100 in its GC context, and we have GC bias value for GC count 100 as 1.53. So this is the GC bias value for GC count 100 basically. The correction factor for this will be 1 by 1.53, which is 0.654. That means instead of counting this sample read as 1, we are going to count it as 0.654. That means we are deliberately undercounting here. You can think of an inverse scenario where the GC count maybe is 10 and we have a GC bias value of say 0.5, and then we are going to count that sample read as 2, that is 1.1 divided by 0.5 equal to 2 reads instead of 1 during counting. So that is basically how we get the GC correction factors for each read individually based on its GC context GC count value, right? So the question is, how do we know that this is a better GC correction method? There are a few ways we introduce in our paper GC Fix, but they are not unanimously popular because it's a new paper. You can go through this paper if you want to know more about that. So that's all about the GC correction and GC bias series. If you like the video, feel free to subscribe and share. And you can also donate to our channel to help our channel grow further. Thanks very much.